Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all. I missed you. I was on vacation, which was amazing. And then at the end of our vacation, we had the opportunity. We were invited to a friend's birthday party, and part of this birthday party was a big one, important birthday. We went to a Carrie Underwood concert, which was interesting for me because I remember Carrie Underwood when she was on American Idol, and apparently she's done pretty good since then. I didn't know this. If you've ever heard me talk about music, I've actually thought about starting a podcast where I just give my hot takes on the music that I just discovered, because usually I discover new artists who are retired now, because I don't keep up with music. I'm just not cool like that. So it was pretty awesome to see that Carrie Underwood's done pretty well. There were a lot of people at the concert. That was neat. A lot of girls in cowboy stuff, which apparently girls all have cowboy stuff, which who knew? Y'all are just waiting for the Old West to return, apparently. And so, I'm going here with, there's a large group of girls that we're a part of, a couple of us guys. And as I'm walking around, there are a lot of women that are all around. And I don't know much about Carrie Underwood, but we're walking through and there's, a bar as you're going in, and they've got concert themed drinks. And that was really cool. I was taking note of them. One of them was denim and, hold on, I'm going to have to look this up. What was it? What is it? Rhinestones. You've heard of Carrie Underwood. So denim and rhinestones, that was one drink that you could purchase. And these were all just normal drinks, but they just named them something fancy. They were all pink. And so, one of them was All American Girl. As I'm walking by, I'm probably not going to order that one. And then another one was Mama's Mule, which I don't know all the connotations or where they got that name from, but I don't want to pick that one. And so I just kept moving and everything. And then we're in the concert and, a lot of screaming, a lot of very high-pitched screaming, if you will. A lot of guys sitting down, a lot of girls standing up. As I looked around, I did keep my eye on this one dude. We're up in the balcony, we're looking down. There's this one dude that he's in a sea of people sitting down, because Carrie Underwood has a lot of fans, again, apparently. But apparently we've all gotten older now, and so we like to sit at our concerts. But one dude all by himself, just standing the whole time, in a sea of people who are all sitting down. This one guy, and I'm that guy was touched by these songs. And but for the most part, it's the ladies who are up there screaming. And I listened to the songs and learned a lot. She's apparently had a lot of bad relationships. She's somewhat angry at all of her boyfriends, but I begin to get the feeling maybe men in general. And I just got to be honest with you, by the time I got to the end of the concert, I was kind of looking around, I'm I don't think this concert is for men. And it took me a while to realize it, but from that point forward, I felt very uncomfortable being there. And I bring that up because that's what we're talking about. That feeling that this is not for you is actually the way that most Christians should feel in any place in this world that we go into. It's what makes church such a wonderful thing, because here you're surrounded by people who think like you, who believe what you believe, who are pursuing what you're after. And when you're not in here, you're surrounded by people that might look like you, but they're pursuing very different things. Their values are very, very different. And so we should all feel a little bit uncomfortable in the world in which we live. And that's what this letter that we've been going through, that's called 1 Peter, is all about. It's written to people who, because of their beliefs, just don't fit in the world around them. And it's amazing, though, because Peter, who was an apostle, he was one of Jesus's buddies, a disciple, firsthand receiver of all of Jesus's instruction. He became the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He's writing this letter to believers who were once a part of his church, but he's sending it to all the known world, because all the believers have been persecuted in Jerusalem. And from that point, because of that, they spread out across the known world. So when he's sending this letter, it's not like he has in mind the Christians who are now in Turkey. He didn't have in mind the Christians who are in Egypt. He didn't have in mind the Christians who are in Italy, the Christians who are moving further east. He didn't have any of that in mind. What Peter had in mind were all Christians everywhere. And when he tells all Christians everywhere that you are an exile because of the beliefs that you carry and the values that you hold and the person that you represent in Jesus, he's talking to us and telling us that we should not feel at home in this world. And that's challenging for us. And I say us because we're Americans, and we love to think of our nation as a Christian nation. And America is incredibly unique in the history of the world. We're one of the only countries that was ever founded on a set of beliefs rather than the might of a ruler. That separates us from every other country, and it creates a truly unique experience, but it doesn't make us Christian. And just because the people at the time, at the founding of our country, were deists who spoke in the most popular language, which was the language of Christianity shaped by the Bible, it doesn't mean that they are emissaries of God setting up a nation for Christians. In fact, what Peter tells the believers that were once a part of his church is, you are a part of a nation, a holy nation, that's going to be realized one day when Jesus returns. And so we're tempted to feel like, oh, we're in a Christian nation. We're not. We're in a nation that has a lot of Christian values, or used to. But very importantly, we are members of another nation that is not yet here. While we're living here, we are in exile. And so that brings us it brought Peter to an important question, and an important question for us. How do you live as an exile? How do you live day in and day out in a place that is not your home? And so in the passage we're going to look at today, this is 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 11 and go 11 through 17. And in this, originally we were going to do all the rest of chapter 2 and the beginning of, and about half of chapter 3. But praise the Lord, I decided to break it into 2 sermons. So you think that's going to make this shorter. It won't. It won't. You're not that lucky. But I wanted us to break this up because I see where at first he's giving very broad instruction. How do you live in this world when you're citizens of another world? And then he goes on in chapter 3 and he begins to give now particular instruction to certain individuals. How do you live in the place where you are? The station of life, the role that you have to fulfill. And so I want us to look today at just the very broad advice that he gives for how do you live as an exile. And, when we talk about this, you're going to see it. I'll go ahead and ruin it for you because it will ruin it. Here's the way that he tells us that we should live. These are the 2 big verbs that you're going to capture here. You should abstain and submit. Now, yet again, I want to say these are not words that we usually think of as power verses. Like people don't usually have some verse about abstinence on their wall in their living room, right? We don't usually throw out the word submit all the time. In fact, when you do, it gets you in trouble. Chapter 3, I originally asked I asked John if he would preach the next sermon. And it was going to be 1 Peter chapter 3. And he looked at it. Let me just read this for you. It's a really great passage, but somehow John ended up passing on it. And then I gave it to Dave Williams, and then Dave Williams managed to pass on it as well and did a different passage. I don't know why. Verse 1 of 1 Peter chapter 3. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Right? What's wrong with that? I don't get it. But anyways, these are not the words that we want to talk about. And we will be talking about that next week. That'll be fun. You'll love it. So anyways, abstain and submit. They're not words that we usually think about, and especially in our culture, we don't like thinking about this, but this is where Peter begins. So I'm going to start in verse 11. I just want to read verses 11 and 12. You can read them silently there, and we'll see how Peter begins to give advice for how we live as exiles. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Now, I want us to hone in on the first thing that he urges for believers to do living in foreign lands on the margins of society. He urges them to abstain from sinful desires. Now, we're going to spend a few minutes camping on this and talking about what that looks like. What does that mean? And first thing that I want to do is talk about the usefulness of it, because this is literally like you're going to, have you ever seen the Bob Newhart skit where somebody's going to a therapist and they begin telling their problems and Bob Newhart listens to them and he says, I'm going to give you 2 words that are going to really help you here. And she's like, okay, great, tell it to me. And he suddenly looks at her and goes, stop it. Just stop it. Stop. Like that's what we're getting here in this moment. And it just doesn't seem super helpful when you're struggling with temptation towards sin for somebody, your pastor from like 1,500 miles away, to write a letter and be like, just stop it, dude. Like, have you ever had that advice? You're like, oh man, I'm really angry at my spouse right now and I feel bad because I said this when I shouldn't have done it. How many times do your friend look at you and go, well, stop saying it, dummy? You know, it's like, that's not helpful advice. What do your friends do? They try to empathize with you. They try to hear from you. But I want to put forward to you, there is a level of empathy with someone else's struggle that goes beyond what God would call us to do. Because the first thing that God would call us to do when we encounter sin is to encourage someone, hey, how about you stop it? And this makes sense in all other places. I think about, have you ever seen those books where it's like how to survive any disaster? And it's like gives you advice. And I'll never forget one on a page because I bought these for my kids. And one of the pages was like what to do if you ever fall in a septic tank. Which, wow, talk about covering the gamut of human experience. What do you do? So what do you think was the first bit of advice? Close your mouth. That should have been it. Get out. Which I'm like, okay, so is there anybody who's like, hey, I'm going to stay here. Go get that book. Go get the book. Bring it to me. Oh, I'm supposed to get out. You know, that's probably not what is going to happen. But so many times we encounter sin in our own lives, and our response to it is to say, let me sit down and just think about this for a minute. Our response to it is, well, you know, I don't know that I want to create division with other people, so I'll just keep moving and it'll be okay. How many times do we keep these sins in our lives under the assumption that, well, if we keep it under control, it's okay? I mean, how many addicts find themselves one day needing to take the most drastic steps after experiencing terrible consequences? And it all began with them saying, I've got this under control. I can handle this. I mean, I think about how many times us with our sin, we're like those crazy people that like try to have a pet baboon or something. And newsflash, baboons like to rip people's faces off. It happens. Or they're like, I've got this pet alligator that's so cute until it tries to taste your leg. Or like the lady that like she had a snake that she would keep in her bed because it liked to snuggle her. Newsflash, that's how constrictors kill their prey. And so all of us, when we keep these pet sins in our lives under the idea that, oh, we can control it, you're like a person with a wild animal in their home. Everyone else is watching, waiting for the day when it overtakes you, when it destroys you, when it becomes exactly what Jesus said it was, when all of a sudden it's like a roaring lion that is going to consume you. That day is coming no matter how small the sin starts, no matter how controllable it seems. And what do we mean when we say control? we mean nobody else knows about it. We don't actually mean that we're in control of our sin. I mean, Jesus makes it very clear that we are mastered by sins. We are slaves to sin. And you are lying to yourself when you try to tell yourself that I can keep this under control. What you really mean is I can keep this under wraps. But the Bible also tells us that all things will be exposed. All things done in darkness will be brought into the light. This is just the reality of the way the world works. Look at pastors who are falling in sin. These are really big, public, obvious demonstrations of what happens in every person's life. There's a sin they think they can keep secret. They think they can control it. They think it's not as bad as some of the other things that I could be doing, that they're doing, that I used to do, so it's okay. And they have no idea that this wild animal is waiting for the opportunity to overtake and destroy them. Sometimes we need to look at people's sin and say, stop it. That's the first step. You have to stop it. And it's because we don't understand how far sin can take us. One of my favorite quotes is from a pastor that I used to have, Adrian Rogers. He would always say that sin will take you farther than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay, and it will always cost more than you're willing to pay. We think we can keep it under control. We think we can control it, but we can't. And so Peter's first advice that he gives to Christians who are living in a sinful, broken world as citizens of another kingdom that has not yet been realized is stop it. Abstain from these sinful desires that are waging war inside of your heart. And as you do so, what happens? There are great natural results from this, which he outlines. Verse 12, he's saying, live a good life so that when people who hate you accuse you of wrong, they're going to look at your good deeds, even when they don't like you. And they're going to say, man, whatever God they serve, at least it led them to do that. And we can see this. You can look at Christians right now in our culture, and we are going to be accused and pilloried and persecuted because of our views on sexual morality in our culture. We will. It is the issue that is going to bring persecution upon the church in America. So we should already be ready for that. We should expect it. And when we're thinking about that, what's crazy, though, is that they're going to try to accuse us of being hateful and wrong, while at the same time, we Christians are the ones who adopt 68% of children in the United States that are in the foster care system. That's what Christians do. They're going to accuse us of being bigots, while Christians are the ones who are going and building hospitals in the poorest areas of every city. They're going to tell us that we're unloving and hateful people, while we're the ones feeding the homeless and the most needy in our culture. We will have people accuse us. And that's why it's all the more vital for us to live lives that are seen as good in every imaginable way. And that begins with abstaining from sin. But this is a hard lesson for Americans. I mean, we live in a culture that is built on you can have whatever you want. If you just work hard enough, you can attain anything. And now there's this new ideology that's totally taken over, that if whatever yourself wants, that's what you need to give yourself in order to be happy. And that's leading to all kinds of craziness in our culture. There is no sexual morality. We've now gone past the point where, one day, if we continue this line of thinking, how do we argue against things like pedophilia, to now there are scholarly arguments being written for why pedophilia is just one more expression of the human heart in love. That is evil. That is wrong. And I think of another quote by J. Gresham Macon that says that what is now speculation in the halls of scholars will one day move armies across the world. That's coming. And we need to understand that we will be persecuted because we advocate for a way of living that is given to us by a king who is not enforcing his authority in this world. We are going to be seen as enemies. And so we need to abstain from sin so that when we are accused, there will still be admirable people that are being accused. I think back to what brought down the Roman Colosseum in the gladiatorial games. It wasn't an army marching in. It wasn't an uprising of people saying this is horrible and awful. It was a stadium full of people cheering as two young girls sang praise songs to God as lions tore them apart. They lived in such a way that anyone who looked at it, no matter how much they hated what they stood for, said, what we're doing is just wrong. And I'm not saying that any one of us is ever going to experience that level of martyrdom. We won't. That would be, if that happens, that's hundreds of years from now. But we need to be living in such a way that even the small persecutions that are thrown at us, getting passed over for a promotion, getting ridiculed online, being shunned by a neighbor, will be seen as inhospitable and strange because I know we don't believe what they believe, but he's just a really great guy. Peter's advocating that there is power in that. And so he's calling us to abstain from sinful desires. But then he continues, and what he says in verse 13, I'm going to read verses 13 through 15, read it with me. He says, submit yourself to the Lord, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. I'm going to stop right there for just a minute. That's pretty broad. Every human authority. We are called to submit ourselves when we are living as exiles, knowing this is not our homeland. We belong in another land that is going to be brought forth by Jesus himself. That means the way that we live in this world is we ignore all the temptations to rise to power and enforce our will over the masses in the name of the Lord. Instead, in the name of the Lord, we submit ourselves to every authority. And he even continues. He says, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So we're called to abstain from our desires, our sinful desires. We're called to submit ourselves to the authorities that God has put in our world. And this is really challenging. Like, to be honest, I heard one pastor say one time, explaining this, calling American Christians to submit to the authority around them is like rubbing a cat against the grain of its hair. Like, it just doesn't feel right as Americans to have someone tell you that your job, your calling by God is to submit to authority. Like, I made it sound wonderful that America was built on ideals and philosophies of man that have been garnered over thousands. We also fought a war. We also killed thousands and thousands of people because there is a rebellious streak inside of Americans, which is one of my favorite parts of America, to be honest. I love it. It helps me fit in here because I don't like authority. Like, in general, I always make the joke, I always have a problem whenever people tell me what to do. Like, anyone, and I think that I represent a lot of Americans. We have problems with authority. And so for Peter to come along and just say, well, submit to them. Well, which ones? You mean like the good ones, right? Like the Republican ones. We submit to those, right? Or we submit to the ones who believe in all of our social issues, right? We submit to those. We definitely don't submit to the sinful ones who promote things that are opposed to the will of God. We don't submit to those. And Peter says, submit yourself to every human authority. And he goes on and he talks about to the emperor. And this isn't because Peter was, writing from some place of safety. For he was writing in the midst of persecution brought on by an emperor who heard about this young upstart that created a revolution over in the Damascus area. Like he experienced the government coming down. He lost relationships to death. He lost relationships because they had to flee for their lives. And he's still writing to them and saying, submit yourself to that emperor. And I mean, we have their names. Like we know the emperor at that time was Claudius. Claudius only had about a 20-year reign. And the reason is because it's generally agreed upon by historians, he was an idiot. Like, he's one of those guys that rose up through the Senate because he knew how to manipulate how people felt, and he was a very great orator, but he was a terrible leader. You can see the marked decline in their international finance, their trade. You can see the way that they began losing wars. Like, historians track, Claudius was an idiot. And Peter's saying, submit to him. Immediately following this, the believers who took this letter and said, wow, this is the way that we should live. This is the word of God, and passed it to other people. They're passing it to other people under the reign of the next emperor, Nero, who is considered one of the most evil Roman emperors that the world has ever known. You should Google, if you're interested, some of the things that Nero did, because he was a human being of horrific evil. I mean, just to give you the lightest thing, he thought that his mom spoke harshly of him when he wasn't in the room, and so he poisoned her and killed her. He is just a horrible human being. He especially hated Christians as this movement was spreading around the world. And so these Christians who are taking Peter's letter and saying, we need to do this, when they read, submit to the emperor, they're thinking, submit to Nero. That's what we're called to do. And this rankles Americans so much. We love to throw off authority. And it's hard for us to understand why God would call us to submit to evil people in this world. And I think about what he goes on to say. I mean, in verse 13, he says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. You don't submit to the authorities that God puts in your life because they're amazing. You don't submit to authorities that God puts in your life based upon how well or poorly they follow God's commandments. You submit to them because God put them there. Peter is explaining that in honoring the authorities he has put in your life, you are honoring God. And so what does that mean for us? Well, we've got an election coming up. It means the Christians should vote. We should partake in the rightful, lawful government management system that we have that is a vote for representative leadership. I understand feeling like you need to abstain. I look at the last, 3 or 4 presidential elections, and it's, I've used this idea before. It's Douglas Adams from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There's this portion where he talks about they land on a planet, and it's ruled by evil lizards, and the characters are like, oh, that's terrible. Why can't you overthrow the evil lizard? Like, well, we voted for them. I'm like, well, why did you vote for the evil lizard? And he's like, because if we don't vote for our evil lizard, the other evil lizard's going to win. And so they keep voting for the evil. That's where we are. That's how I feel about it. I feel like our current presidential election is proof, again, that God is judging our country. Look at the book of Judges. God brings rulers in as judgment against his people. I don't know any other way to interpret what has been going on. I mean, do we honestly think that there are no better Americans than the ones who are currently running for president, the ones that are currently filling the halls of Congress and the Senate? I mean, I honestly, I would vote for us changing to a lottery system where like you just pick a random American. I think they'll do better. I think they will. But nonetheless, we take part in the civic responsibility that's available to us because Peter is telling us how do we summarize this? He's saying, be a good citizen. When you're living in exile, be a good citizen. And so that's my first thing to you is you have a voice in our country. You have a vote. Use it. Go for what the Lord is putting on your heart. That doesn't define who you are as a human being. You are more than your vote, as is every other person you meet. Don't reduce them to that one single thing. This is coming off of the identity that Peter has already instilled in us, that our identity is totally reshaped by Christ. Don't reduce somebody and their identity based upon who they vote for. Vote your conscience to the best of your ability. Take part in what's going on. But at the same time, submit yourselves, knowing that God is the one who is guiding and directing all things. He has purposes that we will never understand. If we were God, if you were God, I promise you, you would end up doing things exactly like he does because his way is perfect. It feels hard because we're living in a land that is not our own. We don't fit here. And so it's never going to feel perfect. But at the same time, we submit. And I understand there are much harder discussions here. We could jump into all of the things. Was Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrong for attempting to kill Hitler? Should you submit to that authority? We can go back to, was Corrie ten Boom wrong because she was hiding Jews in her closet and lying to the police, the governors who were right in front of her? I understand those are real questions, but those are not the questions that you're facing. As the richest nation in the world, we're trying to figure out which of these leaders will help me hold on to my wealth the most. We're not in the same place as people who were in the Holocaust. We're not in the same place as these believers at this time who were being hunted because of their belief in Jesus. And yet they are called to submit. So I tell you, God has put the authorities in place. And that should also give you courage in this season. God's still in control. Yes, there are idiots somewhere else who are moving the dials. Again, I will take a lottery system for any American. But at the same time, we trust God, not the people that are there in power. We submit to God by submitting to the people who are in power. We should be marked, Christians should be marked as the best citizens in every country in which they live, even as they are being persecuted. That's what Peter is saying to us. This is how we get to chapter 3, verse 15, where he says, you should be ready to give an answer to the world for the joy that is within you. Because when you are a good person being persecuted for evil reasons and you're still choosing good, living with joy, loving and serving the people that are around you, people are going to ask, why do you live this way? Why don't you curse them and move on? Why don't you run and flee? And we say, because I don't trust them, but I do trust God. And in submitting to them, I'm submitting to God. That's what Peter is after here. And so as we look at this, I want to give you the summary that Peter finally gets to. because he goes on explaining why, and there's a lot of really simple good things. Like he tells you why you should obey too, because government was given by God to protect the rights of people, the lives of people. He explains that here in verse 14, and we move on though, and we get down to the bottom of this, where he's now explaining in verses 16 and 17. He gives a summary. He says, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. This is just bullet point advice he's giving. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And this is a hard pill to swallow for Americans. Again, we love a good rebellion. It's the founding of our nation. And yet, in that place, I want us to hear the call to abstain from our sinful desires and to submit to the leaders that God has put in our place. And how do we do that? How do we go against our nature? And the answer is really simple. It's given by Jesus. In Matthew 16, verses 24 through 25, Jesus says to those who would claim him as their Lord, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Do you hear that? The steepest persecution that the world has to offer against you is that they kill you. And Jesus is saying, when you lose your life, you gain with me. The Apostle Paul's testimony was that all of life is for Christ, and to die is gain. Like, this is the story. I think about the joke that I heard a pastor talk about. How do you frighten Lazarus? He's already been killed, and he's friends with the guy who brought him back. Like, there is nothing that the world can do to us, because we serve an eternal King who has told us that even at the worst punishment that this world can come up with, it's but a blink of an eye before you'll hear him saying, "Arise, O sleeper, come forth." There is nothing that this world can do to you, because the worst that they can offer to you is a light and momentary affliction compared with the eternal glory that we have offered to us with Jesus. It's just really hard for us to endure waiting for that day where eternity comes true. But if we believe Jesus, if we truly believe that he who has conquered death, who has taken away its sting, will do the same for us, wow, what are we afraid of? There's nothing that can be done to us. But Jesus says, what will it profit for a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Guys, we submit to Jesus. And therefore we abstain from our flesh. We deny ourselves, because it's only a brief time that we're doing so before our soul is cleansed and we live with Jesus for all eternity. We submit to the authorities that are in our lives, because the ultimate authority above any authority in this world has allowed them to be in that place. And we trust him. We deny ourselves and we follow Jesus, trusting in him, not in what we see around us. And that's what it looks like. That's Peter's general advice to people who are living in exile. He's telling us, deny yourself, trust God, and live a good life.